My name is Dr. Richard Blakemore, and I'm in the history department here at the University of Reading. And my area of expertise is maritime history in the early modern period. So what I'm interested in terms of a big question, is the sea and human society. The sea makes up most of our planet's surface, and it's a really important space in the history of human life. People have always depended on the oceans for food and other resources, fishing and things like that. But also it's been really important for travel. In fact, for most of history, it was easier to travel long distance over oceans than it was over land. If you think of the state of the roads at various times in history, until canals and railways come along, it's really hard to shift bulk cargoes over land because of the conditions of the roads. So long distance travel is almost always happening by sea. And in the period that I'm interested in the 1600s and the 1700s, that's a moment of transformation as new maritime routes really develop around the world. So obviously the sea is really important for global history, because this is about how different parts of the world come to be connected, how those connections bring about all kinds of material change, cultural change, political change. Think about the last time you had a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. That has a long history of global trade, maritime travel, for those drinks, those cultures to have become part of the world that we live in today. So within that broad theme of the sea in human history, I'm particularly interested in the social history of seafaring and maritime communities. And there are a few dimensions to that. One area is the experience of maritime travel. While this is a very important space, and while, as I said, it's easier to move bulk cargoes long distances over sea, it's also a very challenging and dangerous space. It's a very hostile environment, and that's certainly how people think about it in the 1600s and the 1700s. So what's the experience of travelling through that space in ships? These are voyages that last weeks, sometimes months. What are the social dynamics on board a ship where people are living together for that length of time in a confined space, having to work together in order to survive in a very challenging environment? What are the cultural ideas about the ocean? Things like songs, plays, ballads and books, and all sorts of representations of the ocean. There's a lot of ocean in Shakespeare, for example. So how are people thinking about the sea? But for me, I'm particularly interested in how the people who travelled at sea experienced that and thought about that environment. How does the physical experience of this time spent at sea mesh with the cultural ideas about the ocean coming out of things like religion, for example? Because people see the oceans in a providential way. God is summoning the storms, but also bringing the calm, sending the winds. So sailors at this time sometimes interpret their own experiences at sea in this sort of cultural fashion. Another dimension of this is the experience of maritime communities ashore. And this has been an area that historians have been increasingly interested in recent years. How much does the maritime dimension of these communities shape life in those communities? How much does the absence of seafarers, who, as we've said, are often going on long voyages, impact on the social dynamics within a community? So, for example, we often see greater independence for women in these communities because they are managing household finances, they are conducting trade, they are actually directly involved in the business of shipping. So there are these connections, even with the absence of seafarers over long periods of time, there are these connections between that experience at sea and the society ashore. And so I'm very interested in how that connection shapes both sides of this equation, both the experience of seafarers on their ships, but also life in the communities on shore and how they are affected by the interaction with the maritime environment. So there are two projects I could probably talk about in a bit more detail in relation to this area of social history of seafaring. One is pirates, because I teach a module on the history of piracy here at Reading, and I've recently published a book on the same history. And piracy is a very popular topic because we all have an image in our heads, a stereotype. I think if I say the word pirate, I can guess with 99% accuracy what image is going to come into your head. But that image comes from exactly this period of the late 1600s and the early 1700s. There's been maritime violence at sea, trade, raiding, all of these things in all parts of the world, in all periods of history. And yet this one moment in the late 1600s and the early 1700s has come to define the concept of piracy that we have in our popular culture, in films, in video games, in toys, and in party costumes and all sorts of things like that. So why does that moment come to define this image? That's one of the questions I'm so interested in. And it's partially because there is a lot of piracy going on at that time, but it's also because there's a lot of media coverage. So again, the cultural side, books, plays, newspapers, songs. And really, the history of piracy is not just about what pirates are doing at sea. It's about the stories that are being told about pirates. And in fact, to call someone a pirate is to make a legal and political judgment. Because to be a pirate is to commit violence illegally. But in this period, there are lots of people who are allowed or permitted or commissioned to commit violence in maritime raiding. We often use the word privateer now, although that term has its own complicated history. So most people who are accused of piracy would not have considered themselves pirates, or at least would have claimed in a court of law, and often did claim, that they were not pirates. Sometimes they were unsuccessful in doing so and they were executed. But it does raise this question of how piracy fits into these broader histories of politics, of law, and of empire. Most European empires that are expanding in this period, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the French, are dependent on privatized maritime violence because they lack the naval resources at this time to carry out that warfare for themselves. So they outsource warfare to these private groups, privateers. So actually, empire is all bound up with piracy, both because they actually need maritime violence to succeed in competing with other empires and in establishing colonies in the Americas and establishing trade routes into the Indian Ocean, but also because the empires define themselves against piracy. So again, it's about the stories that they tell. My violence is privateering, your violence is piracy. And because of this dynamic, piracy actually fits into these broader histories of empire, but also of economics. Plundering is absolutely essential to the growth of colonies like Jamaica and Saint Domingue in the Caribbean, which become the most valuable colonies in the Atlantic, if not in the world. But they get a kickstart to their development from economic development from plundering. And then that is invested into sugar production, which is a massively lucrative business, but is also deeply connected with the history of slavery, because all sugar plantations are slave plantations. And indeed, many people involved in piracy themselves become slaveholders when they make money through piracy. So piracy is about stories, but it's also a big part of the global development of empire, of economics, of slavery, of cultural dynamics. What I like about this topic is that we all have this image in our heads that we can then interrogate. We can look at the primary evidence, which is a big part of what historians do, looking at the documents and material culture that survives from the past. And we can challenge the assumptions that we have. Some of them are definitely untrue. There's no evidence that pirates walked the plank. But some of them perhaps have a grain of truth in them. And that's a very interesting research approach, to take our assumptions, to challenge them, to evaluate them, and then to think about how we connect that to those bigger themes of empire, economics, slavery, and so on. The other project that I'm working on at the moment takes me back to the broader social history of seafaring. And this is a book that I'm currently writing, looking at seafarers' autobiographies in the 17th and 18th centuries. So sailors were actually probably more literate than you would expect. They often had to deal with paperwork, navigation, complicated mathematics. And so writing a journal, keeping records, was a key part of professional culture for seafarers. And from that, some of them wrote autobiographies or more extended memoirs or journals. And there's a few of these surviving from the later 1600s and the early 1700s. And my current book project is looking at 6 of these autobiographies and thinking about how they represent the maritime environment in their writing, what it can tell us about their experience, their encounters with that environment, can tell us about the social dynamics aboard ship. People have often used institutional records like the Navy or the East India Company. I've done a lot of work with legal records in the High Court of Admiralty. But the issue with those documents is that they focus on moments of conflict and they always come from an institutional perspective. Whereas these autobiographies bring us closer to what the seafarers experienced and thought about, or at least said about, the life on board. Obviously, they come with problems. They reflect their own particular perspective. But nevertheless, it gives us a different way of looking at the communities aboard. And one theme that I think has come out of that is we tend to think of life at sea as very harsh, of tough, often really defined by conflict because everyone is being squeezed into a really tight enclosed space. And all of those things are present. But something that also really comes out is the camaraderie, the culture, the community. These people are working together. Some of them have really established friendships that last over many voyages, over much of their career. So that's a side of this history that I think has not been told and that I'm really trying to draw out in my reading of these texts. Again, this also connects with ideas about empire because all of these sailors are involved in voyages to the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic, to the Indian Ocean, even sometimes into the Pacific Ocean. They're moving between empires. They're all British seafarers, but some of them work on Dutch or Spanish ships at times. Some of them are captured by North African corsairs or Spanish or French vessels. So there's really an experience of moving between these different imperial powers and the encounters that these seafarers have. And then related to that is the question of national identity. How do these seafarers think about themselves? How do they write about themselves in relation to Englishness, because they are all English, but then how do they write about other national identities? How do they depict the world around them? And some of them are very much travel writers, and travel literature is a big booming genre in this field at this time. So many of them are sort of tapping into that success, that popularity of narratives of the unusual and the exotic, and they're really kind of playing up those dimensions in their writings. And then a final thread brings me back to the social history of communities ashore, because another dimension that comes out of these autobiographies is these seafarers maintain those relationships with the maritime communities ashore. This can often be very hard to trace, because we don't have a lot of paperwork or documents written from the point of view of sailors' wives, for example, or sailors' children. We have quite a lot about sailors in the employment of big institutions, and we have records like sailors' wills, which can give us a sense of their family connections, but they have a very specific purpose, and they're often produced in that legal context. So in these autobiographies, we get much more discussion of the relationships, not always as much as I would like, but certainly detail about the connections that they have, repeatedly returning to see families, the importance of local communities to these seafarers, even though they are going on voyages that last for years and go halfway or even all the way round the world. The regularity with which they come back to these communities and the importance, the meaning of those relationships is something that I think comes out really strongly in these texts. So what I'm trying to do through these projects is, as I said, explore how individuals and communities in human society have engaged with the maritime environment, travelled across the sea, encountered other cultures, brought about really dramatic changes that have really transformed the world we live in today. So much of our world now comes out of these exchanges and these voyages and these interactions. But I'm also interested in that individual dimension, that community dimension, and trying to think about the big picture of the sea in human society, but bring to it a personal, a human dimension that comes from the study of individuals and of communities. So I recently published this book on the history of piracy, which is based on a module that I teach here at the University of Reading. And one of the things I like most about the front cover of this book is the way that the design has really got an 18th century font. So they've really gone for a style of lettering on the front that looks like books from the 17th and 18th centuries writing about piracy. And I think that really accurately reflects one of the key themes of this book, which is all about the stories that we tell about pirates and that we're told in the 1600s and the 1700s, because that's such a big part of the image that we have in our heads today. And probably the most important book in the history of piracy was a book called The General History of the Pirates, which was published in 1724. And this was a compendium telling the stories of many pirates who had been active at that time. And more than anything else, that book has set the image of pirates. If you think about people like Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, Stede Bonnet, Bartholomew Roberts, they are all in this book. This is where those stories come from. And so part of what I'm trying to do in my book is think about how that print culture, that discussion of pirates has created all of these images that we have today, and how that relates to the history and what we can discern of the reality from other primary sources. Now, The General History of the Pirates was published in May 1724, and my book was published in May 2024, which was enormously satisfying because you just don't get 300th year anniversaries all that often. I don't think it mattered to anyone else quite as much as it mattered to me, but it was very satisfying. So what I do in the book is I try to tell a chronological narrative from the 1650s through to the early 1700s, although we also look back to the Elizabethan period and some of the early history that kind of sets the scene for what is developing in the later 1600s. And I think a bit about the legacies of that period and modern piracy at the end of the book as well. So there are three phases of piracy, if you like, the book is separated into. There are the Caribbean buccaneers from about the 1650s to about the 1680s, led by figures like Henry Morgan. And these buccaneers, although that term originated later, but we can call them buccaneers, claimed not to be pirates. They claimed to be commissioned by the governor of Jamaica, and even though England was not at war with Spain at the time, the buccaneers claimed that what they were doing was legal under the terms of warfare and law in this period. That causes all sorts of diplomatic problems in London and in Madrid, and it kind of sparks a big debate about what is legal raiding and what is piracy. But the buccaneers, by and large, seem to manage to keep themselves on the right side of that line. So Henry Morgan, for example, actually sues a publisher who publishes a book calling him a pirate, wins that lawsuit, and goes on to become the deputy governor of Jamaica. But it starts these questions about the legal status of piracy, of maritime violence, which had already been raised in the previous centuries and decades in European waters. But as this has expanded to the Caribbean, it's causing more questions about whose jurisdiction stands there, what rights colonies have, what rights empires have, what policies governments ought to take in terms of piracy. In the second phase, some of those buccaneers move into the Pacific and the Indian Oceans to attack the Spanish Empire in the Pacific and the Mughal Empire in the Indian Ocean. So into the 1690s, we get a rise of what's often called Red Sea piracy, because they are targeting ships in the Indian Ocean sailing between Mecca and northern India. These are pilgrim ships on the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage, and they are fabulously valuable ships and cargoes. So these pirates are definitely moving beyond the law. They have no permission to attack either the Spanish Empire in the Pacific or the Mughal Empire in India, but they claim that they are justified because there are wars going on at the time. They're supposed to be attacking French ships, but they go and attack Mughal ships instead. There are also religious hostilities, particularly in the Mediterranean, between some Islamic states and Christian states. And that may too have kind of provided a justification for attacking Muslim Mughal ships. But that causes a crisis because the East India Company is trying to trade peacefully and is suddenly under enormous pressure because the Mughal Emperor blames all English for being pirates. So the East India Company puts that pressure on back home as well, and this forces the government in London to change its policy. It can no longer be quite as permissive about plundering as it had been in previous centuries. And so we get new legislation, particularly a new act in 1700, which is really trying to tighten up the rules about what counts as piracy and make it harder for people to get away with some of what these plunderers are doing. That is immediately followed by another war. And again, all of these raiders get employed by the British to attack the French Empire and the Spanish Empire in that war. So there's continued employment for these plunderers for another decade. But when that war ends, the government once again is trying to prevent piracy. And that war has also brought about a change in attitudes in the colonies. So in the buccaneering period, people were quite happy to support the buccaneers in places like Jamaica or North America because they derived considerable economic benefit from doing so. Many of the plunderers who went to the Indian Ocean in the 1690s came from New York, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, or other colonies in North America. But by the 1710s, after the end of this further war, those colonies have changed their economic position. They've become much more concerned about social order because slavery is increasing in those colonies. So there are now majority enslaved populations in places like Jamaica. So the colonial authorities are very worried about disruptive forces, including pirates. And there are other changes to do with trade and policy as well that means that they are much less receptive to piracy. So what we get in the final phase, in the 1710s and 1720s, is this massive surge of piracy at the end of a war, and that's quite a common trend where previously employed privateers carry on plundering but are no longer really allowed to do so. But what happens here is that they can no longer get away with it in the way that some of their previous generations might have done so because the laws have changed and the colonial attitudes have changed as well. And that moment gives us Blackbeard, Stede Bonnet, Bartholomew Roberts, Bonnie and Reed, Calico Jack, all of these figures who turn up in the general history, which is a reaction to that really specific moment. But because all of the conditions have changed, it's also a very unusual moment. The pirates we get at that time are more radical, more violent, more unstable, more dangerous, because they haven't got associations ashore. They've been kicked out of society ashore, so they seem to go to a more piratey end. They are the most piratical of the pirates. And so there's a deep irony in that this very unusual moment of piracy, which is not like plundering in most other periods of history, has come to be the most significant moment that defines the image of piracy that we have today. And for that, we really have to thank the general history as well as other texts and cultural ideas floating around at that time. And of course, if you'd like to know more, the best thing you can do is get a copy of my book.